Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And today I'm going to be talking about the pros and the cons of earning a degree in psychology. What was the process like? What are the things that I did like? What are the things that I didn't like? All that. So, I earned my degree in 2019. I graduated as a straight A student. And in my senior year, I served on what was called a student advisory board, which was something that I think was unique to my university. But essentially, it was like a council of students who were nominated by faculty to work as a liaison between the faculty and the students to express the students' needs for each department. And I was that for the psychology department and the psychology students. I mainly say that to express that I was very involved in my kind of university and the academic side of my degree, not just kind of getting classes, that sort of thing. So I want to talk about the pros and the cons of earning my degree, the things that I liked, the things that I didn't. Let's get into it. So let's talk about the pros of earning a degree in psychology. Well, the first pro, and of course the biggest one, is going to be that you get to study psychology. If you're interested in this field, then that's going to be a good thing for you. Like most degrees, you're not going to do a ton of psychology coursework in your first 2 years of college. It's mostly going to be math, history, writing, but that's pretty much every single degree. But once you cross that line and get to the third and fourth year, you're going to be spending a lot of time in psychology related classes, and you'll get to learn all about the various styles of psychology out there, the different branches you can go down: industrial, organizational, clinical, social, personality, all these sorts of things are things that you will get to take classes about and learn more about. And to me, that's really interesting that there's so much that you can do with psychology. One of the other pros of this is that psychology is a pretty generalized degree, especially at the bachelor's level. You can't really do a ton with just a bachelor's in science of psychology, and we'll talk about that when we get to the cons later on. But one of the things that is really good is that it can be applied to many different fields. I've seen people work as life coaches, including myself. I've seen people work as consultants. I've seen people work as user experience designers. I've seen people work in like mental health crisis hotlines. There's a lot of different things you can do with a bachelor's of science in psychology. Another great aspect of psychology degrees is that of the STEM degrees, psychology, in my opinion, is one of the easiest. And that's because at the bachelor's level, psychology is very theoretical. You're going to be talking about theories of mind. You're going to be talking about the psychologists and philosophers that came before the 21st century. You're going to be, in general, just talking about a lot of theory, and that comes down more to kind of memorizing facts than it does to applying information, doing research, measuring things, these sorts of things. Now, when it comes to research, you will have to take some math classes. You're going to have to take statistics. You're going to have to take research methods. But again, at the bachelor's level, this really isn't that much. And in my opinion, it's pretty easy. There's not much that goes on. You're going to learn a little bit about, populations, standard deviations, these sorts of things, and how to apply them to basic psychological research. But you don't really get into like the real meat of psychology research until you get to the graduate level and you start taking those graduate level courses. So at the bachelor's level, in my opinion, psychology is one of the easier degrees you can get, and you spend a lot of time learning interesting things as opposed to doing really complex coursework. Now, depending on where you go to school, you will get to do interesting assignments and projects and things. In my undergraduate degree, we did a lot of like role playing types of assignments. Sometimes we would be teamed up with graduate students who were trying to learn how to do counseling or therapy, and we would be the recipient. And then sometimes we would get to do therapy type of activities where we got to practice being the person who was giving the therapy, of course, in non clinical settings. My favorite thing that I ever did in my undergraduate degree was we got to do a mock therapy session with an AI. And that was really interesting because we got to kind of practice therapy with a client, but there was no risk of hurting anyone or damaging anyone because it's just a computer, it's just AI. And they brought in this company from outside the school to come and allow us to do this. And it was this big event. Anyway, that was really interesting. So you get to do kind of cool stuff like that throughout your degree, depending on which classes you take. And usually there's going to be a lot of role play type stuff through a psychology degree because they want to give you the basics of what it might be like to work in something like therapy. Now, therapy is not something that you can do with a bachelor's of science, and that's something that we're going to talk about to transition over into the cons. And that you really need a higher degree to do anything significant with psychology. Unfortunately, a bachelor's of science isn't really the kind of degree where you're going to usually stop and then just go from there. You can do it. Again, I've seen people work in like crisis hotlines or as user experience designers, life coaches, these sorts of things. But if you're actually interested in working in formal psychology as a field, you have to get a higher degree, either a master's or a PhD. A master's typically if you want to be a counselor of some kind, and a PhD if you want to be a licensed psychologist or someone who works in the more research oriented things related to psychology. So you might just be thinking to yourself, well, that's great. I would like to get a PhD or a master's. I'd like to go on and continue my education. The only problem is that because regular psychology degrees are so easy to get compared to a lot of other STEM degrees, these psychology graduate programs are extremely competitive. I graduated with straight A's from my university, and I have research experience, and I have publications, and I have not been able to get into a PhD program in the 3 years since I graduated. And it's just because you have to have a ton of experience. You have to really, really stand out from everyone else in your field to even be considered someone who is worthy to be in a graduate program, especially if you're going to be picking a more competitive program. I'm picking clinical psychology, which is, from my understanding, the most competitive psychology degree that you can enter into. So maybe it wouldn't be as competitive if I was picking something like a master's program or maybe like an education PhD, something along those lines. I'm not sure. I don't want to discredit anyone who's gone and got those degrees, but from my understanding, the clinical psychology PhD is very competitive. So you have to be ready to maybe even take a few years between your bachelor's and your PhD to get research experience if you didn't manage to get it in undergrad. In my experience, I didn't get into research until my final year of undergraduate because I didn't know that I needed it. They don't tell you these things when you're in your undergraduate degree. They don't say, okay, well, if you want to get your PhD or master's, you need to get research experience now. So while I was going through my degree, I was just like, great, I'm getting straight A's. I'm doing fantastic. I'm going to have great grades. I'm going to apply to graduate school and they're going to love me. And then I got to the end of my degree and they were like, yeah, you need more research experience. And I was like, oh, no one told me that. And I didn't even know that these opportunities were as available as I thought they were. I did eventually get involved with a lab and I worked as a volunteer there for 2 to 3 years and got a few publications under my belt. But even with all those things, it's still hard to get into graduate programs. And that's something that you need to consider. Are you willing to get into a field that's going to be hyper competitive to get into these 5 spots that every school has? When you're applying to clinical psychology PhD programs, the average school only takes 5 to 10 students a year if you're lucky, and they usually have 300 to 500 applicants. So that means very, very few people get into these programs, even if they're very qualified, even if they got good grades. It's just extremely competitive. This next point is going to be a point of contention and might not even be a problem to many people listening, but it was something that I found disheartening when I kind of got into the higher education, the more graduate style classes in psychology, in that as you get higher and higher into your psychology degree and the field, you start to get less theoretical and you start focusing more on empirical things. And some people might love this. If you're someone who's closer to an empiricist or an objectivist, you're really going to enjoy graduate level psychology because there's a lot of just, this is the fact, this is a number, this is what we're studying. But to me, that isn't as interesting as a lot of the theoretical stuff that you get to study in undergraduate. And you kind of move away from some of that, and your peers will start to shun you if you're interested in theory as opposed to facts. And that's something that I didn't really like. When I thought of, oh, I want to get a doctor in philosophy in psychology, I thought I would be studying some philosophy of psychology as opposed to just the kind of empiricism, objectivism of psychology. But that's going to just depend on person to person because I still think that both, of course, are valuable. I just think that it's almost too one-sided when you get into graduate psychology classes where it's just they only want you to view these very, numbers-based, factual looks at the field of psychology, and they don't want you to kind of think of new theories or think of creative ideas. They don't challenge you to think outside of the box. One thing that I like to say about the academic field of psychology is that it's full of extremely intelligent people who aren't very interested in trying things that are new or outside of the box. Another aspect to consider is what life in academia is like. Academia is quite different from what you might expect it to be, in that you think you're just going to go in, you're going to get a tenured faculty position, you're going to be a professor. In reality, those positions are very hard to get. So if you're someone who's interested in becoming a professor, you're going to get your bachelor's, then maybe get a PhD, then become a professor. Those positions are very hard to get. And once you get into those positions, there's a notorious problem in academia known as publish or die, in which universities really want professors to be kind of pumping out papers as quickly as possible. So professors are writing paper after paper after paper. They're getting these grants, they're getting this funding, they're doing as many research things as possible. And it's just kind of like oversaturating the research market with stuff that isn't terribly useful or interesting, in my opinion, to the field. I mean, I've gone and looked at professors' pages and some of them have like 90 publications. And you're thinking to yourself, like, there's no way that most of this is relatively even like usable. the methodology becomes questionable, things of that nature. It's essentially just you have to recognize that when you get into higher academia, there's a problem in that you're not always going to be in full control of the kind of research that you want to do, and you might have to maybe work for a university to get funding, but that university is going to require you to do research that you're not interested in. Independent research is possible, but it's extremely expensive. So to get independent research verified and approved, you have to go through an institutional review board, IRB. This is kind of like an ethics committee. Now, most universities have an ethics committee, so if you're a professor at a university, you can just go to the ethics committee or the IRB there and submit your thing, and it's no problem. But if you don't work for a university, then you can't use their IRB usually, unless you know a professor there, which is a possibility. But most of the time, you'll have to do it through an independent IRB, and that can cost anywhere from $800 to a few $1,000s for them to even say that your study is ethically approvable. Now, this is a huge barrier to entry for people who want to work in research, especially people who want to work in individual research. It means that science is kind of gated by money in higher academia. You kind of either have to be a professor or you have to be someone who's going to be able to make enough money to fund your own research and get these things approved. This is not something that I think is great, and I think it's something that needs to be reworked in the future, but that's not the discussion for today. Today, I just want you to be aware of the fact that you are going to probably have to do research you're not terribly interested in at first, or if you get into a faculty position, there's a good chance you're going to be kind of put into that mindset of publish papers or don't be eligible to work at the school that you're working at because there's people who have more papers than you. Now, it may look like I've painted a bleak picture for the field of psychology, but that is not the point that I want you to take away from this video. If anything, I think I want you to know that psychology is a really amazing field, but it's one that you should consider the risks for when you're entering. These were things that I did not know about academia and psychology as I was getting into the field. I didn't know that you were going to need all this research experience to graduate and get into a PhD program. I didn't know that there was going to be a replication crisis and that there was going to be a publish or die mindset in academia. I didn't know that there was going to be less philosophy as you got more towards the graduate level courses. And this is something that you should really consider because as someone who loves psychology, I like really theoretical things. And you have to realize that as you get higher and higher and higher in your education, you might experience less of that, or you're going to have to stick more to the more empirical things, which is fine. I still want to be a clinical psychologist, and I'm willing to put aside my interests in many theories to study these things because that's really what I'm passionate about. So that should be the thing that really motivates you to get a degree in psychology: passion and interest in the field, to understand the human mind and the human experience. If you're someone who wants to really understand people, psychology is going to be a great degree for you. You're going to be able to learn a lot. You're going to be experiencing a lot of really interesting and unique things. You're going to study theories that are going to change your perspective on how you understand the entire world. And I think that's something that is really unique to the field of psychology as a philosophical science, as a science that studies things that aren't always going to be just facts and numbers.